For
All right, thank you, everyone. Let's please return to our seats and we'll move forward with the next session. For those of you who weren't here earlier, my name is Akshay. I'm a graduate research assistant with the Fletcher Russia and Eurasia program. We've just had some excellent discussions. So this morning we spoke about Russian adaptations, and then fittingly just now we spoke about trading with the enemy and the impacts of the trade and export controls that have been going on between Russia and the West. So building on these discussions, we'll now turn to Russia's manufacturing and technology sectors, how they've fared in an attempt to sustain its war economy, and also the ability of Western export controls to effectively target these sectors. Before we move forward, I'd like to make sure we thank the International Security Studies program here at Fletcher for their support to make this session happen. And I'll now like to turn the floor over to Alexandra Vacroux, who will moderate this session. Dr. Vacroux, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Great to see so many familiar faces talking about so many very important topics. And it's my pleasure to moderate this distinguished panel. I'm going to introduce everyone with a few quick words, and then we'll just go down the table with opening remarks and then move into Q&A. So to my right, our first speaker, Alan Maggard, is an analyst at the Center for Advanced Defense Studies, also known as C4ADS. Pavel Luzin, to my left, is a visiting scholar at the Fletcher School and also with the Center for European Policy Analysis. Chris Miller almost needs no introduction, professor of international history at Fletcher and expert on chips, among other things. And we have a surprise addition to our panel, who is Vladislav Inozemtsev, director of the Center for Post-Industrial Studies. Please.
Hi, my name is Alan Maggard. I am a Russia analyst with the Center for Strategic, past employer. I'm the Center for Advanced Defense Studies. So my research, my research focuses on Russian defense industry, overseas supply chains, and I focus particularly on computer numeric control or CNC machine tools. CNC machine tools are computer programmable metalworking equipment that are used to automate the production of metallic objects. They're very precise and very reliable. There's very little risk of human error in them. And they're very much a quintessential dual-use good. I would argue, I'm biased, I'd say they're the quintessential dual-use good. You can use them to make components, the same model CNC machine tool you can use to make components for an automobile or components for a cruise missile. So last June, I put out a report titled War Machine. It's a very original title. And the focus of that was looking at the Russian defense industries and specifically defense contractors, their efforts to procure CNC machine tools from abroad after February 2022. And the takeaway from that report is that export controls, sanctions were working in preventing the defense industry from getting a hold of these machines. Now, granted, these are massive machines, like they're just big, giant boxes. You can't smuggle them in the same way that you could like microchips. But the data that we found showed that, in particular, after countries like South Korea, Taiwan, who were kind of late in adopting these export controls, did adopt export controls on CNC machine tools, you stop seeing less of them in the Russian trade data. So there's a success story there. Now, a lot of my current work is still looking at machine tools, but really looking more at Russian manufacturers of CNC machine tools and CNC technologies. And my research to date has found that these companies whose sector has sort of suffered since the end of the Soviet Union, now, because of sanctions, export controls are getting a lot of money in from the central government to stimulate production, stimulate innovation. But when you look at the trading activity of these Russian CNC technology makers, it's the same exposure, still same reliance on foreign technologies that you see with the Russian defense industry. And just to give a few examples, there's Russian CNC automation producers who have to import US designed microchips or Chinese electric motors from China. So a lot of my work right now is just focusing on what are the vulnerabilities of those companies, those manufacturers, with an eye towards making sure that the Russian defense industry can't lean on them in the future and become sort of resistant to export controls and sanctions as part of a broader import substitution strategy.
Great, thank you.
Yes. Hi, everyone. And I'm completely agree with Alan because machine tools are the key for understanding Russian military-industrial complex. And the dependency on the machine tools imported from United States, Germany, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and so on, is huge. For example, the serious manufacturing of T-72 main battle tanks became possible only after import of machine tools from West Germany and Switzerland in early 1970s. The manufacturing of artillery barrels in Russia is 100% dependent on Austria-made radial forging machines imported since 1970s. For comparison, last year, one of the American factory replaced Austria-made radial forging machine purchased in 1976. Because this machine, it worked perfectly well, but this machine did not allow to increase the production rates of artillery barrels here in the United States. The same problem takes place in Russia right now. Gunpowder industry, solid rocket fuel industry is 100% dependent on German-made industrial equipment and even on chemical precursors. So currently Russia is cut off from this. And okay, Russia is trying to use China-made machine tools. Russia is trying to overhaul the old machine tools imported even in 1980s. But you know, the average cost of single unit of machine tools imported from China is much lower than the average cost of machine tools previously imported from Germany, for instance. What does it mean? That means Russia has access to more simple machine tools, not to the advanced ones. And that is also the problem for Russian military industrial complex. One more point. In 2010s, one of the Russian economists, the best specialist in military economy, Vasily Zatsepin, he made the calculations and he concluded that every single dollar invested into the defense sector of Russia gives only 70 cents of output. The Russian military industrial complex generates net losses every year. For instance, in 2016, 2020, just in 5 years, before 2022, the cumulative net loss of the Russian military industrial complex was about 2 trillion rubles, more than $30 billion. It is a net loss. And now the significant part of the Russian defense budget is going for covering these permanent net losses. And these net losses are growing. For instance, Kurganmashzavod, main Russian manufacturer of armored vehicles. This factory declared that, okay, in 2023, the revenue of this factory grew up for 40%. Yes, but the cost of manufacturing grew up for 45.5%. The inflation of costs, they generate net losses, technically. And sanctions, current sanctions, made these things even tougher for Russia. We may remember that in June 2021, several months before the invasion in Ukraine, Mr. Rogozin, that time head of Russian Space Corporation, Roscosmos, he made a speech in Russian Council Federation. And he told that, guys, that sanctions made our space industry just like a zombie. We can do nothing with this. The satellite navigation system is deteriorating. Optical intelligence satellites are deteriorating. And we can do nothing with this. It was 2021. Currently, any single industry within the Russian military industrial complex may say this, the same thing. And, you know, in a long-term prospect, there are no good outcomes for Russia. And the only possible way to survive for them is simplification of products. And they are already doing this. I mentioned Kurgan-Mashzavod. They started to produce BMP-3 armored vehicles without main 100 millimeter guns, only 30 millimeter gun on board. But the problem is that there is a tough and risky political outcome. Because if you want to produce a simple arms, you don't need so huge military industrial complex. You don't need 2 million employees. You need less of them. So you have to cut a significant part of current beneficiaries of the war. And how to deal with this? Currently, the Russian authorities don't have an answer on this. But at the same time, you should take into account that sanctions do not prevent the will to fight. You may see it, Hamas, Hezbollah, Houthis. These guys do not need, you know, any sophisticated military-industrial complex. They just want to fight and want to die. But nevertheless, they cannot win the more advanced armed forces. They cannot defeat them. And probably the same may be true for Russia. Russia will continue to produce arms, but these arms will be much more simple. I am stop here.
Thank you. Chris?
Well, we've heard lots of examples today of ways in which sanctions have underperformed relative to their expectations. I'd like to give you a case study of the opposite happening in a industry that you might not expect to be front and center in analysis of sanctions, and that's the Russian auto industry. I would submit to you that when people like Peter were designing sanctions, Russian autos probably weren't at the top of their list relative to finance or energy, and justifiably so, which makes it even more interesting to ask the question, why has the Russian auto industry suffered so much under sanction, despite the fact that no one was really focusing on it? At the end of 2023, Russian auto production was 40% the level of 2021. An extraordinary decline that outpaces the decline in basically every other sector of the Russian economy, with perhaps the exception of aviation, where the data is a little bit messy and hard to be sure of. So why is it that the Russian auto industry was hit so hard by sanctions, despite that it was not a primary focus of sanctions? There were some export controls imposed by the US and Europe that did make it difficult both to sell cars to Russia, but also to produce cars in Russia. But the reason I think has to do with some specificities of complex manufactured goods, which I'd like to lay out for you here. So briefly, the Russian car industry has a history as follows. During the Soviet period, all of the cars and all of the components for cars that were sold in the Soviet Union were produced in the Soviet Union. There were actually foreign designs like Ford and Fiat and others that were used by Soviet car companies, but the components were all basically domestic. The machine tools were imported sometimes, but the components were domestic. In the 2000s and 2010s, the Russian auto industry globalized. And just like the rest of the world's car industry came to rely on components from Europe and the US and Japan and Korea and Taiwan and China in their production. And that was necessary for efficiency because a typical car has around 20,000 components on average. And so it's natural to have a whole lot of specialization. But the downside of specialization, the downside of long supply chains is that they're easy to break. And indeed, if you're just missing one of the 20,000 components you need, if it's the wrong one, your car might not be possible to function. And what's more, a lot of the components are specially designed to work in a very complex system. So if you've got the wrong transmission for your car, it won't fit. If you've got the wrong semiconductor, it might not work with your software design. And so what Russian car companies found is that although they had factories full of machine tools throughout 2022 and 2023, most of these factories were non-operational. And today the level is still around half are operational. In other words, you've got the tools in place, you've got the know-how because the workers are largely still there, but because you can't source all of the components, you can't make cars. And this is, I think, interesting because most of the components were not actually under sanction. Some of the semiconductors were, certain types of components for luxury car parts were under sanction, but many were not. And yet we saw a catastrophic decline in the import to Russia of windshield wipers, of locks, of windshields. If you go down the list of auto components, you'll find that there were collapses in basically every category of auto component. And what's more interesting, although many of these components in general are produced in other countries, there was not a major increase in supply from countries like China because you need the right windshield to fit in your car and the right transmission and the right set of semiconductors have to already fit with the software in your car. And so we end up with the situation in which the Russian car industry is decimated. Today, most of the cars that are produced in Russia are either completely redesigned and very simplified relative to what they looked like before the war, or actually Chinese in origin, where now the car and all of the parts are imported exclusively from China and set up in factories that used to be manufacturing Western cars. But the primary strategy that actually Russian car buyers have turned to is importing from China. And so in 2023, China was the largest source of exports for the Russia was the largest source of exports for the Chinese car industry because the domestic industry was still in such a difficult position. So I think this is an interesting case study for thinking of sanctions overperformance relative to expectation. But I think it's also worthwhile to reflect on what this means for potential future sanctions against other economies. Because I think we've learned over the course of the first sessions today that the energy industry was perhaps more immune to sanctions because it produced commodities. And the same is true for the metals industry. I think manufacturing industries, and the more complex they are, the more this is true, are more fragile. And if you think about future scenarios vis-a-vis China, what you find is that China's not a commodity exporter. It's a manufactured goods producer, deeply, deeply integrated with the US, with Europe, with Japan, with Korea, with other countries' supply chains. And so I would posit to you that if you expect a future China scenario to look like a Russia scenario, that you might be looking at the wrong industries, and that rather than looking at the resilience of Russia's oil and gas exports, you should perhaps look at the fragility of the Russian auto sector, which was barely sanctioned, somewhat accidentally so, and yet nevertheless hit harder than almost every other sector of the Russian economy.
Thanks, Chris. Vladislav?
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here, and it was very interesting presentation. So it's big set to speak the last one because I can react on everything which was said. So I would say that yes, I completely agree with Professor Miller because in Russia, I would put it in a little bit different angle. In Russia, the sanctions policy in industrial sphere, they hit much harder the civilian industries, complex civilian industries than the military ones. So it was absolutely true, everything which was said about the automotive industry. The same can be applied for civil aircraft, which are not produced at all in Russia these days, and to many other domestic civilian industries who were disrupted by the lack of Western spare parts and components. That's absolutely true. Moreover, I would say that these sanctions or maybe restrictions, they backfired also to the Russian-Chinese cooperation. For example, because before the war, it was a huge project of designing a absolute joint project of Russian-China civilian aircraft, CR-929, which is now abandoned just because the Russians cannot do their part of the job because it was once again tied to foreign spare parts and technologies. The second point about the military industry, it's not so obvious because, as Pavel absolutely right said, the Russian military industry was less globalized than the Russian civilian industries. And these days, what the Russian military industrial complex is doing, to my mind, it's of course a lot of primitivization of their produce. They are trying to, renew the Soviet age models of military equipment, and they are quite successful in this. I cannot agree fully with the idea that if you are producing old-fashioned technology and old-fashioned military equipment, you should have smaller military industrial complex, maybe vice versa, because just the opposite. Because if you have very low productivity, if you are reviving Soviet technologies, you have to have a lot of workforce in these enterprises. Moreover, I would say that I would be very careful in saying that the military industrial complex is producing losses, because if you look on the Soviet past, you will see that the prices on which the government acquired the military products were for many decades anyhow were not connected with the market prices. And so because of this, either in the Soviet Union or even in Russia in 2000s and 2010s, there were several campaigns when the government, the military industrial complex produced losses, but then the government compensated it for these losses because the losses actually were caused by the government pricing. And this is the same kind as it was in the Soviet Union. The government underprices the real product, then the losses mount, and then the government actually writes off the loans or subsidized loans. So this is not very not the best example of for saying that the military industrial complex is going bust. The next point is about it was very interesting question here about the secondary sanctions and how it works and how it can work. I would say that on the previous session, it was very good debate about the companies which are still in Russia or which are leaving the country. Most of them are really somehow still in the country. And one of the very important issues in evading the sanctions, I would say, is something which may be called intercompany trade. Because, for example, the fifth package of EU sanctions prohibits the exports to Russia, for example, chemical substances for painting. But several companies which are still operating in Russia, for example, Tikkurila of Finland or AkzoNobel of Netherlands, they still import the substances for their domestic production in Russia, which actually doesn't fit completely the idea of pure exports to Russia. Yeah, and many other companies are still present in the Russian Federation, and they are even expanding their businesses. AkzoNobel profit in Russia expanded by 800% in 2023. And even before they said they are quitting the Russian market, now, there was a big inquiry on Euronews, and now they say that, yes, we never said this. This is not on their website anymore. They said we are looking for some kind of, methods to evade the Russian markets, but we don't want to quit it altogether. So how the secondary sanctions can be organized, I would say, and it would be, I think, the last issue. My point is that the idea of sanctioning, for example, the Chinese banks was much better than everything else, because if you are sanctioning a company, saying that, look, if you are trading with Russia, you may be sanctioned. This is a good idea, but nevertheless, for some companies which are crucial for the Russian market, the share of this Russian market is quite huge. It may be 20 or 30%. And these particular companies would be very interested in keeping their presence in Russia. So they will evade it by any possible means. They will trade via Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Armenia, and whatsoever. And they will do all the best to stay on the Russian markets in one or another fashion. But if you sanction banks or if you threaten banks with the sanctions, you address an entity, which it was said about the risk on the previous session. I completely agree. You are threatening the entities which produce very small part of their revenues from the Russian operations. Industrial Bank of China, of course, it might be a bank which actually operates or manages most of the transactions with Russia, but in its combined income, it will produce revenue, it will produce maybe less than 1%. And to risk its American operations and European operations for such a small amount of money, it doesn't look a good strategy. So this is perfect measure to address banking businesses all over the world for stopping this kind of parallel imports or other trade dealings with Russia. It's much more effective than to address the companies themselves who are trading with Russia. So to finish with, I would say that the most crucial thing was actually put forward by Pavel, who said that the Russian industry without cooperating with the West will degrade somehow. And by the end of the day, it will actually deteriorate very severely. I agree. The major question is when it comes. Because if this phenomenon, which I call growth without development, the Russian economy is growing. It produces 3-4% GDP growth, but it is really becoming more primitivized every year and more primitive and less sophisticated. That's true. How long it can sustain in this capacity is the first question, and how long this primitive military-industrial complex can generate huge losses to Ukraine when engaged in the war. This is a major question. So when talking about the sanctions against Russian industry, you should see how deep they can penetrate the industry and how fast they can produce the result. And once again, I will finish the automotive industry, aviation industry, were perfect examples of how big this effect may be. And just because these industries were very much internationalized, the next would be the oil processing sector, because it was refurbished with Western-made equipment in the last 15 years for 70-75%. And there are a lot of problems to change this equipment for Chinese one if the Ukrainians are successful in destroying some part of the capacity. So I will stay and finish here.
Thank you, Vladislav. I have a million questions, but before I start asking them, let me actually take from the floor. Yes, please. Let's introduce yourself.
Sure. My name is Eddie Fishman from Columbia. I'm really interested. I learned a lot from all of you. I wanted to ask a couple follow-up questions to Chris, just because I thought your perspective on autos was really interesting. We learned from our, Alina in the last panel that, transshipment is a big problem for military goods. Why is that not the case for autos? Are we not, is Russia not doing that? Question one. Question two is, to what extent is the war economy and sucking labor out of industrial production for domestic goods impacting things like the auto sector as well? Because these workers used to be on the line making cars. Now are they? And then the third is to Sergei Alexandro's point earlier about Smetana. To what extent are Russians upset about the fact that their Avtovaz vehicles don't have airbags or anti-lock brakes? Is this something that, do we have any evidence that this is causing frustration? I know that in the United States there would be a lot of frustration in this area.
Chris?
Well, on frustration, I guess there's been some newspaper articles. Beyond that, I don't know that there's been Smetana style visible yet. I think in terms of why there's not transshipment, there is, I think, to some degree. And if you look at the trade data, there's some really confusing spikes in Slovak auto parts shipments in certain months. But I think the complexity matters. You're going to transship, you get 20,000 parts an hour which, for a typical car, let's say 3,000 of those are produced domestically in Russia, means you have 17,000 parts you need to transport to other countries. What we know is that Russia is capable of bringing in certain components for military systems. We don't actually have background data, and Pavel probably knows better than I, as to your typical missile system, how many are domestically sourced versus foreign sourced. But I think the strong assumption is that they're mostly domestically sourced, and only the things that can't be sourced domestically are foreign sourced. Whereas with autos, it's not really the case that was the dynamic. You source from the most efficient producer, and therefore you mostly foreign sourced, and that was Russia specific. That's just fucking. So I think that the scale of transshipment is actually much larger of a challenge in a civilian industry than in the defense industry, because you have a larger share of your components to transship. In terms of the labor shortages, I think this is probably relevant. I think it's also probably relevant that China's just become a very cheap, big producer of cars, and so better to import. But I think it's also the case that despite China's efficiencies, one wouldn't have presumed a 40%, I'm sorry, a 60% decline in Russian auto production. And that sanctions are probably the primary. The sanctions and actually the voluntary company withdrawals, creating their own supply chain disruptions are probably.
Just one second, can I ask Pavel, do you want to comment on whether it's true that there's the same proportion of domestically produced to imported parts in missile production or?
It is a really hard question because, okay, electronics is electronics. The problem is that the production of Russian cruise missiles currently relied on the storage of engines produced in late 1980s in Ukraine during the Soviet times. Even the new missiles, they still use 35 years old engines. So how we can calculate this, whether or not it is a domestically made engine or it is an imported engine. So I should say that Russian arms manufacturing was really globalized, and currently Russia is cutting off from this, is being cut off from these supply chains. And what will be next 3, 4, 5 years with manufacturing of these types of sophisticated weapons, we don't know. We don't know. And even if today there are some percentage of import components, in 5 years we may see completely Russia-made cruise missiles, but these specifications of these missiles will be completely different. So I don't know how to compare, how to calculate the level of dependency from import in any single unit of arms.
Okay. Thank you, Dan.
Thanks. Chris, I have a question for you as well. And while I want you to be right, I am extremely skeptical of your conclusion. So you said that what we should take away from the Russian auto industry is that sanctions imposed against China might actually, be a little more effective than we thought, because sanctioning complex manufacturing, different from sanctioning commodities, and that's what China's done. 2 responses. The first is that there are some commodities for which China is extremely important, particularly with regard to critical minerals. It's not just the raw fact they dominate the process. And so I'm not sure that entirely works. The second and more interesting theoretical question is, China as a manufacturer is just such a large footprint. The way to put it is, no one needs Russian manufacturing experts. I'm not sure that's true of China. And so I guess I'm a little skeptical of the claim that, China would suffer significantly under some of the sanctions.
Well, I guess I would say we would all suffer under the sanctions, because if you remove Chinese manufacturing output, that's everyone who's a consumer of that. So I'm not embracing that as a good outcome. I'm just saying I think the disruption would be far larger. But I think the disruption would be far larger. So if you look at China's exports, almost half of exports are either electronics or machinery, broad categories, which are complex manufactured goods. Now, I think there's certain types of electronics that you're going to be more able to produce domestically in a short period of time, others less so. But I think we ran this experiment in real time in 2022 with the auto shortages globally. So the world, global automakers, US, Europe, Japanese, Chinese, Korean, are estimated to have sold several $100 billion worth fewer cars due to chip shortages in the auto sector. So, essentially a limitless amount of money was available to solve the chip shortage. And it was not possible to solve except over a period of months and in some cases literally a year. And I think that is basically a natural experiment for what separating Taiwan and China economically would cause. Whether you want to do that, different policy question, but I think it is the case that it would just take a very long time to rejig your supply chains and any sort of flex system, redo your software so that it works with different types of components, especially like ours. And I think the software part is key. If you talk to auto manufacturers, like, why couldn't they solve the chip shortage? It was because if you brought in a different microcontroller, you had to redo your software. Redo your software, your brakes didn't work, and it cascades down. And so I think you look at what China makes to make products that fit that. So I guess I think it would be highly disruptive, judging both from the Russian experience and the chip shortage in the auto industry. Whether that's a good thing, whether it works politically, I think is a different question. Will it work in terms of being highly disruptive? I guess I have a pretty good confidence answer to this.
Right, thank you. You've also answered one of the online questions asking for a specific example of how you break long supply chains. So thank you for that. A twofer. Yes, Craig, and then Margarita.
Thank you very much, Craig Kennedy at Davis Center. I have a question for Mr. Inozemtsev. You shared the view of others on the panel today that sanctions are degrading Russia. The question is, how deeply, how quickly. My question has to do with what indicators we should be looking or tracking in the sense of how that's emerging. We've been fixated with GDP, of course, but some people would argue that's really not that meaningful because it's measuring expanded military production, which is creating productive resources for the economy going forward. It's creating destructive resources. Other places to look, there's inflation. And I'm wondering whether you feel that inflation is being undermeasured or underestimated right now. But one thing that very few people have been focused on, but actually seems to me to be very important, that's the massive expansion of credit happened. Credit markets in 2023, we saw a 35-40% expansion. Is equivalent to an entire federal budget spending just in the private manufacturing sector. Which in many ways explains that growth in GDP because they're borrowing like crazy, but with no prospect of peace. And then eventually, as we all know here from 2008, you get a credit crisis, and the same holds for Russia. Is that something that you've been looking at? I know Dmitry Bielorussk from Russia has been looking at it. Is it something we should be looking at? And what do you think?
Look, it's a very good question. So first, I would say that the expansion of the Russian economy, like the GDP growth, it doesn't originate entirely from the military-industrial complex because the government pays a lot of money not only for the military production, but for the military personnel as well. And this is around 3 trillion rubles per year. It's 2% of GDP. It goes into the economic sector. It produces a growth in service sector and whatsoever. The two most important issues are you asked about the inflation and the loans. Inflation, to my mind, is not so much important because if you look back on the Russian economy of 2000, the first two Putin's terms, how big the inflation was, an annual inflation between 2001 and 2008, it was 13.6%. It was official inflation was twice, 1.5 times more larger than today. So if you can forecast the inflation next year, if you have 8% now, 9% next year, 7% next year, it is not a factor which will undermine the Russian economy. It's predictable. A predictable element of the economic activity is not so much damaging. So I'm not sure that inflation is the number one problem for the Russian economy, and I would anticipate it will become a little bit lower next year. Maybe not much lower, but a little bit. The loan and credit expansion is really a very strong point you made. It's very interesting. Yes, both the personal loans, consumer loans are booming. The problem with the complete issue with mortgage loans are also not very stable and not very, I would say, predictable, because now the government abandons the program for subsidized mortgage loans, and it is already causing a downturn on the construction market. It will cause much more problems next year, I think. And actually, yes, both industrial complex and both the consumers, they're borrowing a lot. The key rate is going up, and I think it will be even 1 or 2 more hikes this year. So this is a big problem. I may say that at some point the government would be forced to, I would say, to cancel or to compensate some non-performing loans in huge amount of money. Yeah, both for industrial sector and for the population as well. How this can affect the economy, it's not certain. But anyway, to my mind, for 1 or 2 years to come, the government has a lot of instruments for actually somehow to regulate the problem and to not to allow it to explode. But what comes next, no one knows. That's absolutely true. The only point I would say about the fiscal policy here is that the prospective budget for 2025, actually all 3 years, 2023, 2024, and 2025, are marked by the decreasing share of additional military spendings if compared to additional revenues of the federal budget. So in 2022, the revenues were up by 1.6 trillion rubles, and the military expenses were up 2 billion. So more than revenues. In 2023, it was around 6. In 2024, it was 6 billion of new revenues and 4 billion of increase in military spending. In 2025, it is around 40% of new revenues allocated to the military spending. So this shows that the state finances, the federal finance, are not in so bad shape. So they're managing to keep them at bay. But yeah, the private loans and the industrial loans are booming. That's true, and it should be. The central bank should have more precise look on this. And actually, Biulina was successful in cutting this program for subsidized mortgage loans. Maybe something will be made next year for maybe not for resolving this problem, but somehow to managing it.
Thank you. Margarita?
Yes, Margarita Balmaceda. I have a question for Pavel. Alex Maggard. I'm trying to put my head around how to understand some of the insights you gave us in this panel with some of the information and comments that Elena Rybakova gave in the last panel, Inozemtsev also, and about the trips in the electronic toothbrushes, about autonomous military equipment and so on. So my question to both of you would be, we see also a trend in the Russian military industrial complex to maybe replace some of that advanced technology with not necessarily more simple technology, but with a totally different set of military equipment, including autonomous equipment.
By so by military equipment, you mean not like the manufacturing equipment per se?
I mean, robots, drones, and things like that. So, compensating by going into totally different.
Well, I don't know about so much about that, to be frank. I think one thing that the Russian defense industry is looking at very keenly are this isn't really quite addressing the question, but I think it does have ramifications. But alternate manufacturing techniques like additive manufacturing with 3D printers. Again, this isn't quite addressing the answer, but I'll give you the best that I can. Right now, there's been efforts by like Rosatom and some other entities inside of Russia exploring the opportunities for 3D printing as an alternative in defense manufacturing. And one upshot of those technologies is that you don't really have to, you're not exposed to the same kind of supply chain issues as you are with subtractive manufacturing, traditional types of machine tools. Whether or not those technologies can be scaled to kind of replace machine tools inside of defense plants is kind of debatable. But one interesting prospective use of those technologies is just deploying 3D printers en masse to frontline areas. They're better geared towards kind of snap repairs of damaged equipment, say like transmissions on the front line. So, I mean, one pivot, we're talking about pivots to different technologies, is that, you know, and if say they aren't able to spin up sufficient machine tool production, they're not able to produce new units as much, they can turn to these alternative manufacturing technologies to do a better, quicker job of repairing kit that gets damaged in the field. You know, as for drones and all of that, I would turn to Pavel more. But with that being said, there's not a whole lot of transparency from the research I've done as to what's going on, how they're manufacturing some of the drones, supposedly like in Alabuga. You know, there are charts that have come out showing the layout of the plant at Alabuga, but there's only like 3 machine tools there, a couple of little devices for basically stitching together synthetic fibers into wings. Like, it's not a huge operation. So, I mean, who knows how much of what they're sending into Ukraine right now is originating in Alabuga versus Iran is frankly something I don't really follow. I'm just more in the weeds looking at the machine tools themselves. But, you know, if let's say that, you know, most of those are being manufactured in Alabuga, hypothetically, knowing what I know of what kind of like manufacturing equipment they have there, it wouldn't be like a huge leap for them to, you know, pivot more towards drones. And that's to say nothing about, you know, all the Russian civilians out there who have been purchasing Chinese 3D printers. These people aren't really necessarily aligned with the state in any way, but there's, if you go on Telegram and scratch enough at it, you'll see, you know, a few dozen accounts who, like, all they do is they have like a few dozen 3D printers sourced from China, and they're just making replacement parts for drones, or they're making, you know, release systems for like dropping improvised munitions from drones. So I think I get the sense that like Russia is experimenting with these alternative manufacturing techniques, and to the extent that there will be a pivot to these new war technologies, new military technologies, a lot of it will be facilitated by new innovations and manufacturing.
We already see this replacement in electronics. Russia almost lost the access to military grade and space grade electronics, but Russia actively uses and replaces this electronic by consumer grade electronics and industrial grade electronics, even on satellites in orbit. Towards the drones, drones are palliative measure because drones replace the sophisticated, high precise weapons. Iranian drones replace the cruise missiles because Russia don't have so many cruise missiles. So it is a replacement, it is a simplification of arms manufacturing. That doesn't mean that, you know, even Iranian drones, 99% of them hit it, but 1% can hit target, can hit, I don't know, hospital or civil building and create death. But nevertheless, Russia is not becoming stronger with all this replacement. And look at Ukraine for comparison. Ukraine didn't have any advanced types of high precise weapons. And they started from really simple drones. And currently, they are producing sophisticated drones with jet engines, and they are trying to hit targets deep inside the Russian territory. And Russia is trying to produce more drones, and these drones are much more simple than Russia even produced 3 years ago. Because Russia produced Orlan 10 drones, Russia produced Orion drones. And now Russia tries to rely only on China-made or DJI Mavic drones or something made with Chinese components. So the simplification is a way for Russia, yes, but this simplification also limits Russia's combat capabilities.
After this, to address, I believe this is.
Identify yourself.
I'm Vitaly Shkarov. I'm with Tufts University. The point is, the problem is within the different orbit, because if you think about the drones, if you look at the statistics, Ukraine burns currently per month roughly 200,000 drones. 200,000 drones. I guess how much the whole entire industry of drones is producing in Europe is just 10%. So even if the whole Europe would produce at the highest capacity possible, it would be not enough to supply the Ukrainian army in fully to combat. Now, what Pavel just said, what's happening right now is the simplification of those tools, and because of that, you basically address the problem not just of Russian manufacturing, but also of Ukrainian manufacturing. So Ukraine depends the same way on Chinese parts, drone parts in a higher scale, like Russia as well. So by cutting off production with Western tools from Russia, you do not address the problem, because the tools and the parts coming from China to Russia and to Ukraine at the same time. So in this sense, Russia is like a proxy to this deliveries, because they have political and economic relations with China. So you cannot cut this tree entirely, because you cut the supply for Ukraine at the same time. And you don't have to have the sophisticated warfare to combat, as Pavel just perfectly said. The simple drones, 3D printed at home, Ukraine made a wonderful example of this, are enough to combat against highly expensive, very technologically advanced, produced high precise weapons. So I believe the calculus is a different dimension. It's not about like, can you produce it? It's how can you deal in a times of war with different measures and different tools and be still successful as Ukraine is. And there's no good solution right now, because the problem is not the AI or the technology. The problem is that most of European shops are completely booked and sold out for actuators, for navigation system, for GPS antennas. You cannot buy them. You just simply cannot buy them. The only one who can produce in such quantities is China. So Russia and Ukraine in the same way depend on China. And this is the problem. Sorry. Oh, thank you.
Introduce yourself. Hi there. I'm Simon Cooper in the situation. Thank you for this terrific panel. I have questions for all of you, but I'll direct just one to Chris, since it's very relevant to the China case that I work on. I think your thesis, if you're right, is very significant for economic deterrence and also imagining what a crisis scenario would look like in U.S.-China relations. But I wonder if there's an intervening variable that might be explaining some, if not a significant amount, of what you're seeing in Russia's auto production policy, which is that as soon as Russia came under sanctions by the West, it became much more vulnerable to economic coercion by China, or rather it had to become a rule taker. As I understand it, Russia has historically put tariffs on autos coming directly from China. And a big part of the story of Chinese auto sales in Russia rising in 2023 was transshipment through EU countries, essentially to evade the tariff, which Russian customs officials turned a blind eye to because I guess they didn't want to antagonize China in 2023. And there's been talk that I've seen, and I don't read Russian media, but I read Chinese media, talk out of Moscow about potentially cracking down on that now. So to what extent can we explain this boom in Chinese auto exports to Russia in that China has a lot of overcapacity? It's essentially producing these cars at a loss. They have to dump it somewhere. Russia's a very convenient dump.
Right, can I tag on a little
Please.
question to that, which is, I'd be interested if you could parse out the extent to which the impact on the Russian auto economy has come not from direct sanctions, but from the self-sanctioning of companies that left.
Yeah. So self-sanctioning, I think, is important. You look both at automakers and at least their tier one suppliers and find that a number of them have said they were pulling out of these factories. I think there's an interesting question to ask going back to the self-interest companies. Did the automakers and the tier ones that pulled out, did they pull out because they were being ethical and trying to appease Mikhail, or did they pull out because actually they couldn't produce because their component supply chains were messed up? And I think there's some evidence. Renault, for example, said it was going to think about pulling out and then didn't pull out, got in trouble for not pulling out, and then it pulled out once it went. And I think that probably is not unique. So it is actually tricky to actually ascertain where is it self-sanctioning, where is it supply chain disruptions that are masked in a as an ethical public statement. But I do think the self-sanctioning did probably have an impact, and I think the impact is probably, if you're looking at your complex supply chain, which is totally messed up in February, March, April 2022, and you've got questions, can you transship all of the components you need? And some of your component suppliers are saying, we're going to self-sanction. Even if you discount that heavily and assume that half of them are lying, if half of them are not lying, you still have a sludge in them. And so I think that was kind of the dynamic of, this is just too complex to even conceive of. We're just going to give up, which is what happened. So on China, I mean, so Russia is still importing cars from other countries. It still imports cars from South Korea, for example, which are, again, not sanctioned and still legal to import. And so there are other import channels. Russian car consumption has rebounded, not completely to 2021 levels, but substantially, again, in line with the fact that real incomes are higher than they were pre-war. So I don't think it's the case that Russia was necessarily solely a price taker. I mean, I guess I understand your point that China could have sort of leverage on Russia had it tried to limit imports of Chinese cars, but then it could have turned to Korea and bought more Korean cars, higher prices. Perhaps it would have been problematic politically if purchase of Korean cars would have increased more, but ultimately the key dynamic was they didn't have any cars. And so if your car production has collapsed, if you're at 40% of pre-war production and 80% of that consumption, there's only so many places you can look. And simultaneous to all this, China became an attractive car producer. And so I think that is essentially the result of, or the reason for why there's so much importation of Chinese autos. And Ladas, for what they're worth, Ladas are actually pretty price competitive today. There's a lot of subsidies that go in. They've been downgraded in terms of the capabilities to a certain extent, but it's not the case that there are that where Russia is able to produce, it has domestic consumption or domestic production, but where it's not able to produce it is imported.
Thank you. We have time for one more question. Yes, please.
Constant paradigm being fill the breach. One thing we haven't talked about on sanctions, which is difficult to sanction, is intellectual property. A lot of stuff in the press these days about Chinese espionage with U.S. defense technology. So I'm wondering how much of that are we concerned about being transferred to Russia, along with potentially parts. And I think of perhaps the press on the hypersonic missile, which you know, for air defense systems can be very difficult. It apparently is not all as cracked up to be now, but it could be with perhaps some additional technology. So my question is that something we're hearing much about in terms of intellectual property transfer?
Thank you, sir, for the question. Towards the intellectual property, of course, Russia is trying to get access to technologies, to components, and currently one of the biggest Russian priorities is a so-called reverse engineering, so copying. But there are two big problems. I can give you an example. It was late 2010s. It was a factory, one of the manufacturers of Russian electronic warfare systems. And they invested tens of millions of rubles to replacement of one electric component in this electronic warfare system. Not electronic, electric component. This electric component they imported from Europe, somewhere in Europe. They tried to make a reverse engineering. And after 2 years of efforts, they closed the program because they told, we know how it works. We cannot reproduce this. We just don't have industrial base. We don't have engineers to do this. And another example, it is one factory, machine tool factory in Ivanovo, in Russia. And there is a chief designer of machine tools. And he gave an interview to one Russian state-owned media. And the journalist asked this guy, oh, so what is your main achievement in your life? And this chief designer, he was just 34 years old. It was 2023. And he replied, you know, we tried to make a reverse engineering of one machine tools from Czech Republic. And we did it. And you know, it started to work from the first time. That is my main achievement. So how to make this reverse engineering? Okay, you get intellectual property, or you stole American aircraft engine, but you cannot reproduce this because different industrial base, different technologies, different engineering schools. And the second biggest problem is an educational system itself in Russia. The deterioration of school education, the deterioration of university education is so huge during the last several years. People who graduated from these schools, civil schools who applied for university, and people who graduate from universities, they're badly educated. And even if they know how it works, they cannot reproduce this. They don't know how to deal with these things. I don't mention electronic things. I don't mention, you know, some sophisticated rocket fuels and so on. They are not able to reproduce electric components. They are not able to reproduce aircraft engines developed in 1990s. They just cannot do this. They are suffering from this, but can do nothing.
Thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to jump on Pavel's point about you know, the talent pool in Russia today, and I agree that, you know, you may hypothetically have this desire to reverse engineer technologies, and he's right that, you know, they may have the capacity to get those designs, that IP somehow, but in terms of, especially in the defense industry, I was reading, believe it was the journal promreg.ru. It's like a industry Journal. Huh?
Exciting reading.
It's really exciting reading. I do a lot of exciting reading. I forget who the speaker was, but the quoted figure was that the defense industry in Russia right now has a shortfall of, I can't remember if it was 50,000 or 500,000 trained engineers and designers, but it's somewhere north of 10,000. It's a lot of people that they don't have to be able to look at these designs, make them understandable for the engineers inside of Russia. But like a broader point in terms of just the war in Ukraine, I'm not gonna like talk about broader geopolitical competition. Like, do they really need IP for advanced military weapons to prosecute the war right now? There's this thing I call the good enough principle, and it applies to what kinds of machine tools are they importing, what kinds of weapon designs are they trying to prioritize. Like, is the machine tool you're importing good enough to produce what you need on the battlefield? Is the IP you have at the moment good enough to achieve the goals that you want to achieve? And if the answer is yes, then, stealing IP is a concern, but I question, I won't say that it's not or it is. I question whether it's a huge priority outside of maybe the defense industry. I'm sure there is interest there, but and then the concern right now is in terms of waging the current war is doing the best they can, getting the most out of the resources they have, those resources that are good enough.
All right. Thank you very much for your questions, and to the panelists. Please join me in thanking them with a round of applause.